Queer representation has always been a sticky subject, particularly the matter of good queer representation. Part of what makes good representation so hard and the discourse so unending is a simple fact. Good representation has an element of subjectivity. What matches one person's experience might seem insulting or stereotypical to another, even outside of the many other factors that can affect how representation comes across to a group. Ask 5 queer people if a character is good rep, and chances are you'll get 5 very different and very nuanced answers. This is especially true if the media in question is formative or a point of nostalgia for the queer in question. If you want a piece of media to see you when you're just starting to see yourself, of course you're going to be more forgiving of the lens. But sometimes a piece of media you otherwise love manages to drop the ball so hard, you just have to talk about it. You have to break down why it comes across so poorly, why it's offensive or hurtful or just plain bad. Even if the creators had the best of intentions. Especially if the creators had the best of intentions. Hi, I'm Moth. I'm a biromantic asexual woman, and today we'll be talking about the aromantic asexual representation in Monster Prom. Naturally, spoilers for Monster Prom will follow. So, first things first, let's meet this Arrow-Ace character. Kale was first added in the support group Secret Ending, released in the 2020 Valentine's Day You Do You update. The only way to access this ending is to buy a certain item from the in-game shop. This item is unlocked by playing the game enough times. I'm not sure how many. You may be surprised to hear there is Arrow-Ace representation in Monster Prom, and frankly, you wouldn't be the only one. I couldn't find exact numbers on how many people have played this ending, but I doubt it's very many. Here are my reasons. Firstly, there doesn't seem to be a lot of fandom knowledge of Kale. Checking sites like Tumblr and Reddit, there isn't nearly as much content of him as the other characters. When I checked Archive of Our Own for fics where he is a tagged character, I found a grand total of 14. There's a total of 1,049 fics tagged as Monster Prom, meaning that less than 2% of fics feature Kale as a tagged character. While there might be more that just don't tag him, I don't think that's very likely, given how AO3 culture heavily promotes accurate tagging. Likewise, when I searched around on Tumblr for posts related to Kale, I found less than 20 unique posts about him. Again, this could just be what I searched, but I think it shows a wider fandom trend in how invisible he is. Secondly, there are some reports on the Reddit and the fandom wiki page for the item in the PS4 version of the game being glitched. This glitch means that the Kale conspiracy board does not appear in the in-game shop, so Kale cannot be met. I couldn't find any information on whether this glitch has been fixed, but regardless, it would make it harder for people to learn of Kale. Finally, and most importantly, there just doesn't seem to be that much interest in unlocking all the secret endings within the fandom. Looking at the Steam achievements for unlocking the non-love interest related secret endings, all of them have been achieved by less than 10% of players. There isn't an achievement for the Kale-related secret ending, so this is speculation, but it wouldn't be a stretch to assume that there were similar statistics for the support group ending. Okay, with that context out of the way, let's briefly summarize the Kale route and secret ending along with some of the mechanics. This route consists of 3 scenes, and begins when you purchase the Conspiracy Theories on Why You've Never Gotten to See Kale Around Here item from the in-game shop. The 3 scenes each have 2 choices in them that slightly affect the exact narration you get, depending on what you choose. To fully unlock the secret ending, while playing out a scene, you have to choose the option in which you have higher stats. If you choose the right option, you'll succeed and will have the opportunity to play out the next scene. If you choose the option in which you have the lower stat, you'll fail and the game will narrate what shenanigans occur to lock you out of the route. I'm also going to take a moment to define some terms here. I've been using route and secret ending interchangeably to refer to pursuing a certain route in-game to unlock an ending. However, I'm using player and protagonist to refer to 2 different people. The player naturally refers to the person playing the game, while the protagonist refers to the character that the player is controlling. This, as you'll see soon, is an important distinction to make. During the first scene, the protagonist reflects on why they've never considered Kale as a romantic partner. They decide to rectify that and begin pursuing them. They find Kale discussing a video game with 2 other characters, Scott and Damien. There's a brief discussion on how there's no wrong way to play a video game, before the protagonist attempts to flirt with Kale. No matter what you do, he gets uncomfortable and leaves. The protagonist then resolves to find a way to appeal to Kale, and the scene ends. The second scene opens with the protagonist reflecting on where they went wrong and finding Kale under the bleachers with yet another character, Polly. The 2 are smoking weed, and the protagonist attempts to impress with weed-related knowledge.
They do, and when they finally get Kale's attention, they immediately try to flirt. Kale gets uncomfortable again, leaves, and Polly snaps at the protagonist. The protagonist, completely missing the point, resolves to try again, and the scene ends. The third scene escalates the protagonist's behaviour from kind of creepy to holy shit, this is outright stalking. The protagonist must call upon the expertise of another and convince them to help track Kale down. They are directed to a house that Kale happens to go to every week. The protagonist arrives at the house with various objects they intend to use for, intimate gratification, only to discover that this is a support group meeting for asexual and aromantic people. Coach comes out as asexual and Kale comes out as aro-ace. The two explain how the protagonist's behaviour is making Kale uncomfortable. Kale chastises the protagonist and asks them to leave, at which point, feeling completely and utterly ashamed, they do. The final scene, which takes place right before the titular monster prom, involves the protagonist throwing a prom pity party over what a terrible person they are. Kale shows up, the protagonist apologizes, and Kale invites him to prom platonically. Congratulations, you've completed the route. Let's start with what I liked about the Kale secret ending. This section will be short, because there was really only one thing I liked about the ending, and that was Kale's friendship with Polly. Polly is a very sexual character, and it is something of a stereotype that asexual people dislike or hate people who are sexual. It's part of a wider perception of asexuals as puritanical prudes. While sex-repulsed asexuals do exist, it's not a moral judgment, it's more a feeling of disgust or revulsion at the thought of having sex. Having Kale be friends with Polly is a subtle way to subvert that stereotype.
See? I said it was a short list. Let's talk about some factors in why I dislike this ending so much. I could see a critique of the only asexual character having to be unlocked, but honestly, I don't really have a problem with that. As I said, Kale was added after the game and released in a Valentine's Day update. Most of these updates only added secret endings that had to be unlocked for newer players. The secret endings they added for the Valentine's Day update are, interesting. We will get into that, but I don't think the idea that Kale himself is only accessible through a secret ending is necessarily bad. And for the record, it's clear that some people did like the representation in Monster Prom, even if I didn't. While researching, I found a bachelor's thesis in game design from 2022 talking about how queer gamers felt about Monster Prom. It was honestly quite an interesting read, but what's relevant here is how the 4 participants in the study responded to Kale. When discussing the asexual representation in the game, the reaction was overwhelmingly positive. To quote from the thesis itself, 2 participants, when hearing about the asexual rep, nodded, looking hyper-focused on hearing the rest, while another participant let out a long and excited ooh with big eyes. This participant later went on to say, "I think it's really sweet that just being represented in the game, in a game in general. However, I think it's worth noting at this point that none of the participants, at least according to the thesis itself, identify as asexual or aromantic. As a result, the reaction was overall less, oh, I feel seen and represented, and more, oh, it's cool that this identity is being represented by this game." If we go back to the Tumblr tags I mentioned before, most of the posts about the ending are positive, at least at first glance. These posts fall into 2 categories. Either fan art or asexual people talking about how nice it is to see themselves represented. But once we widen our search a little, the reaction from other asexual people is a little more mixed. While most of the tag posts on Tumblr are positive, I still saw some asexual bloggers expressing discontent at how his route was handled. Others expressed happiness at the inclusion of an aro-ace character, but frustration at how the ending itself was handled and how it was more about respecting boundaries than Kale himself. Several, including in this Reddit thread I found in the Monster Prom subreddit, expressed discomfort at effectively being forced to harass him into coming out. When playing this ending with another asexual person, they described it as very after-school special, and I think that describes the biggest issue with this ending. This aro-ace character isn't just another character, they're a part of a larger message about respecting boundaries and treating others with respect. Kale isn't allowed to be involved in the shenanigans, he's merely a victim of them. In a similar way, although Kale says that this time is about him, it isn't really. The focus is on the protagonist and how they feel about being a massive shithead, and how they need to get better at respecting boundaries. And honestly, it feels out of place to have this very serious discussion about boundaries in what is ultimately a comedy dating sim. Just look at the text during the final scene. There's one final meta joke about feeling like you're trapped in a dating sim before the scene shifts into a more serious tone. The coach comes out as asexual, and Kale comes out as aro-ace before the coach begins what I can only describe as a lecture
on aromantic and asexual identities. While this might be useful for allosexuals who are unfamiliar with aromanticism and asexuality, as an asexual person, it was frustrating to have my identity explained to me in such simplistic terms. This was combined with the discomfort I felt for pursuing someone who was so clearly uncomfortable. Overall, it was just a miserable experience. It was also frustrating because of the way the game is effectively punishing you for playing it the way it explicitly wants you to play. This is a comedy dating simulator where the goal is to find your character a date for prom. Out of the choices given to me by the game, I do not get an option to respectfully pursue an arrow-ace person. I only get to throw myself at him like the literal mechanics of the game want me to. You don't unlock this ending by choosing an option with which you have a low stat and failing. If you fail, you are kicked off the route and must pursue a different option. You get this ending by succeeding in every scene. The game punishes you for playing correctly. There are certainly games with dating elements, or even outright dating games, that punish you for being a creep, but this is not that. Monster Prom wrote the protagonist as nosy and a little bit creepy. There are several meta jokes about it over the course of the series, but to write a route where the player has no choice but to make this person uncomfortable and then turn around and blame them for it is, well, it's annoying for the player and somewhat undermines the point you're going for. Another frustrating point for me was the treatment of the protagonist within the narrative for how uncomfortable they made Kale. Putting aside any meta or elements outside of the story we're looking at, this person has repeatedly harassed and arguably stalked another student. The dark humour of Monster Prom normally revels in having its protagonist and love interest engage in crimes such as murder, arson, and kidnapping, but the narrative makes it clear that how the protagonist treated Kale is wrong. So, how is the protagonist punished for their behaviour? They aren't. Coach and Kale explain, in very gentle terms, their sexualities and how what the protagonist did was not okay. The protagonist then feels terrible and leaves. Kale later shows up, the protagonist apologizes, and the two attend prom together as friends. That's it. It's so frustrating how the protagonist's thoughts and feelings are so heavily centered in this route. They receive the mildest pushback imaginable, feel bad about it, and are rewarded with a happy ending. They do very little to make it up to Kale aside from apologizing, after what is arguably stalking and harassment, yet all is forgiven. Some may say that the centering of the protagonist is to be expected. They are, after all, the protagonist. I completely reject that assessment. Monster Prom has shown that it can tell stories that don't center the protagonist. Polly's Locket secret ending is a great example of that in how it centers Polly's feelings and need to be heard about her trauma. And that's just the one I remembered off the top of my head. So no, this isn't to be expected as a part of every ending. Now, from a game design perspective, I understand the intent. These routes have a 3-scene structure, and if you succeed the route, there still needs to be a happy ending. That is literally how the game's central mechanic works. In including this ending, they've added a strong, clear message about respecting boundaries and an asexual character. Both good things in a vacuum. I also understand why the player is not punished for what is literally beyond their control, but from a purely narrative perspective, this fucking sucks.
I have a theory for why this ending has such a clear message on boundaries, even as the player is never given a choice in respecting boundaries or not. The answer lies in the update that added this route. As I mentioned before, this ending was released in the Valentine's Day You Do You update. This update added support group and one other ending to the game. The other ending was called A Change of Place, and it involved hooking up two characters, the Interdimensional Prince and Dimitri. The Interdimensional Prince is an antagonistic character to the players. He will show up randomly and try to marry your current love interest. Dimitri, on the other hand, is a vampire and an antagonist to the Coven, who will occasionally try to recruit the protagonist and others to the dark side. To briefly summarize this route, the protagonist unintentionally brings about the meeting of these two antagonists and they decide to begin dating. The rest of the route follows the protagonist helping them navigate establishing boundaries and figuring out a relationship that works for them. The route then ends with the protagonist joining them and the relationship becoming polyamorous. Now, putting aside the fact that the only canonical polyamorous relationship you can have in Monster Prom is with two antagonist characters, there was a line in the final scene that really struck me. They explain they're super amazed at how thirsty you are all the time and how little you seem to care for other people's privacy. While this is intended as a snide comment about the protagonist, the game is still pointedly highlighting the lack of respect for boundaries as something the protagonist has in common with these characters. It's an intentional and difficult to miss comparison. It may not be directed at the player, but it's still important context. While I'm sure Beautiful Glitch had good intentions, it kind of feels like they wanted to have a conversation about boundaries, and an arrow-ace person was the vehicle they chose to do that with. This is partially because the update that both routes are released on have a clear theme. You do you, and that's great. With that kind of theme, it's only natural that these routes not be about the individual character within them, but rather a much wider message. Unfortunately, because Kale is a new character with no prior development, his entire arc is sacrificed to that message. No piece of media is perfect, and I don't expect Monster Prom to be the exception to that rule. But, in my experience, the types of media that excel at what they're trying to do understand what they are and the kind of genre they're in. While I was researching this video essay, I came across a review of Monster Prom from the gaming outlet SideQuest. While this review came out almost 2 years before the fateful Valentine's Day update, I think the discussion on the game's humour was interesting. In short, while it makes light of some very uncomfortable topics, like addiction and eating disorders, it never makes light of queerness. The question of queerness never once comes up or is turned into a joke. No matter what pronouns you choose at the beginning, cue screaming, you can romance whoever you want, and never once do the other characters say anything about gender. This isn't really true anymore with the inclusion of Zoe's route in the second term DLC. Both secret endings deal heavily with transphobia, but regardless, the question of queerness is very clearly coming up in the secret ending. Kale may not be a joke, but he's still at odds with the wider world. We see this through how the support group is named, support group for asexual people in a world so sexualized it might as well be a dating sim, and how the entire ending revolves around Kale being at odds with the protagonist. This is a marked difference from the normality of everyone else's sexuality, where pansexuality is assumed and gay dads are mentioned like it's no big deal. What's upsetting is that Kale's queerness, when attention is drawn to it, is not within the context of Kale as a character or his experiences with it. It's within the context of how the protagonist has treated Kale, within the context of how awful they feel when it's pointed out to them. I said at the start, I think it's important to talk about these things even when the creators have the best intentions, and I truly do think Beautiful Glitch had good intentions here. And on some level, that's part of why this sucks so much. I can't speak for the aromantic community, but as an asexual person, I'm used to bad or non-existent representation. But there's something so saddening about a comedy romance game putting aside both of those elements and using my sexuality to scold players for playing the game the way they were told to. It's especially upsetting when the developers think that this is a good way to represent me. Despite its many flaws, I really enjoy Monster Prom. I just wish asexual people had a place in its world outside of PSAs about boundaries that the player has no choice but to be the villain in.